So my official role in this context was to be the respondent, and I think that in some sense, many of the themes of my response have already been echoed, so I won't try to be long. I'll try to add some small. I was recently reading a paper by a friend named Shingai Nagara, who's a South African, and his essentially his paper was around kind of looking at global economic history and trying to understand why Africa remains sort of in quotes underdeveloped. And it sort of contrasted Africa's strategies and progress with working models in other parts of the world. And central to that analysis was the discussion of the role of science and technology in economic development. And so in some sense, what I see our panel sort of kind of reprising in some way were some of the points that Shingai Nagara sort of made. And so I'll just reiterate them and seek not to kind of go through each of the presentations in turn. So I think there are 4 key points that emerge from our presentations. So the first one, and that was reflected in Dr. Narayan's presentations, that the world is, and in the questions that were just raised, the world is an interconnected, globalized political economy which exhibits some really complicated behavior. And as such, sort of the relative wealth or poverty of Guyana will be attributed to a number of decisions and actions, and Professor Charles Griffith sort of in gory detail identified those kinds of actions which we need to be taking or not taking, that our sort of wealth or poverty will be attributed, will be a function of the decisions, the actions that we make, and not only our decisions and actions, but also the decisions and actions that are made in other parts of the world. And so hence the sort of mantra, maybe we ought to be doing cosmetics rather than doing sugar. And so we have to be cognizant in our scientific enterprise that we don't sit only in Guyana, but Guyana sits as part of South America, it sits as part of the Caribbean, it sits as part of this hemisphere, it sits in some particular place in the global structure. The second point which emerges, and this was something that came through all the presentations and then finally sort of amplified in Dr. Narayan's presentation, was that, you know, often the advice that comes from sort of, quote, the Washington consensus is perhaps not the most appropriate thing if we actually look at the histories of the United States and China and India and Brazil, is that there has been significant state involvement in the developmental strategies in the scientific enterprise. And we should be very cautious before opening up our agricultural lands to trade, that we begin to think seriously about the value-added components that we need to do in order to more effectively compete in that world. The third point, and I think this came through very clearly in both of the presentations of Dr. Griffith and Dr. Charles, and I think it's, if there's something to take away, I would like this to be taken away, is that these advances in science and technology lead to advances in levels of industrialization, which sort of creates goods and services that kind of stimulate broad aggregate consumer demand at reasonable prices while lifting the standard of living. So I think in Dr. Elroy Charles's, I mean, you know, he gave us an exhaustive list of the agricultural activities, vegetables, root crops, plantains, bananas, fruits, and pointed out the ways in which the production had either increased or decreased and the consequences thereof. And so it's immediately clear to us that not only is it important for us to see kind of advances in science, but the converse is also true. So as was evidenced by I think one of the slides pointed out that in the sugar economy, we went from 334,000 tons to 232,000 tons. So when the science and technology is stifled, a vicious cycle that goes in the other direction sort of comes to play, right? So you get a loss of investment capital, you get a loss of to the issues of credit were talked about. So a loss of profitability, diminishing industrialization. So this was also mentioned in terms of the brain drain. We have less people who can do these things that we want done. And the lack of availability of goods and services. So more importation to meet the sort of consumer demands. Thus kind of, I think, perpetuating this kind of underdevelopment that we're attempting to break out from. And then I think the final point that I will say as part of this is, this goes to the end of Dr. Ryan's presentation. Said, I suppose in some sense he was asking kind of like, what is the Guyanese Renaissance in science and technology that is being imagined by the three folks here? And I think I think all of the participants, but I think this was amplified in the final presentation, sort of, let's look, yeah, this Guyanese Renaissance in science and technology will not occur unless Guyana, and so someone mentioned explicitly questions of postgraduate, so understanding that having a bachelor's degree is good, but you're just learning the basic things there. Having a master's degree is a little better, but you're still not in the business of creating new knowledge. Having a PhD, you've probably created like the first bit of new knowledge. And so we need to have some things in our country that are at the postdoctoral level. And I think the point that was made was that, and it was also made in Professor Charles Griffith's presentation, in reference to his reference to the amount of money that our government will spend on research and development. So the thing is that unless we make an intentional effort to be an actor at the sort of cutting edges in the advances of science and technology, then we're not going to see this Guyanese Renaissance. It's not enough to have bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, but we have to have a place where folks who have doctoral degrees do the kind of work that is necessary in this context. And then the last and the very last point, I think this requires the development of kind of holistic, I think the word was used, and a kind of strategic thrust that has as a sort of strategic driver the recognition of our indigenous knowledge systems, right? So the history of us as indigenous peoples coming to Guyana from many different places and kind of somehow finding ways within our science, technology, and mathematics, but I will also add something else, finding something within that context to tap into our history, our histories as peoples, and in particular, our indigenous histories as peoples. This is perhaps the value add that we can add to our scientific enterprise. And then the final point, which I wanted to make, was I think there was very strong recognition within this context of our indigeneity, of recognizing that the arts play a significant role in our imagination, and ultimately science is a business about curiosity and imagination. And so as we deal with curricular issues which were mentioned in the talk, I think this panel rightly kind of makes a call for the importance to not just do STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but perhaps what we need is STEAM education, science, technology, engineering, the arts, and mathematics. And so I'll pause there and thank you.
I want to give recognition to this young man. Here's your slide. So this is amazing. Each one of those cells give 1 volt.
Nice.
For about 25 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith.
Each one of those cells give 1 volt for about 25 seconds. It's the same thing with the motor car engine and the piston. You know what you're playing with there? And that is only 6 feet. Each one of those cells give 1 volt.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
this is a young man, Mr. Please stand, Mr. Arnold, who's worked for us together. Thank you.